Well, for more on the challenges Chinese immigrants faced in the U.S., we're joined by Shelley Fisher Fishkin. She's the Director of American Studies at Stanford University. She's also co-director of the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So, the Chinese migrants who built the U.S. transcontinental railroad have been described as the forgotten workers. I mean, more than 150 years on, why do you think so few Americans even realize their contributions?
Well, a big factor is that there is a long history of not treating the Chinese as full participants in the American experiment. And this goes back before they came to build the railroad. Chinese who had settled in San Francisco in the 1860s, before the railroad began, found that they were the victims of racist violence from young hoodlums and also from the police themselves. And indeed, Mark Twain wrote about this as a journalist. He documented the persecution of the Chinese in San Francisco. When the Chinese came to build the railroad, it was a remarkable feat, and there was an influx of 10 to 15,000 workers from China who blasted and chipped through 15 solid granite tunnels in the Sierra Nevada to build the railroad. They were paid less than their white counterparts. They worked harder and longer hours. And without them, it would not have been finished when it was. And it played a huge role in the development of the U.S. as a modern nation, and the development of the West. It allowed people to migrate to the West more easily. It allowed products to be shipped all over the country. It was huge. But as soon as the railroad was completed, there began to be a surge of anti-Chinese violence and anti-Chinese resentment. They were scapegoated. And it wasn't, as I said, it wasn't a new thing. I mean, back in the 1860s, in addition to being persecuted, there was a law passed in California. Chinese could not testify against white people. That meant that a Chinese person could be accused of a crime and he would have no recourse because he couldn't testify against a white person. There were hundreds of anti-Chinese riots across the West in the 1870s. Notorious ones in every major city, in Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. And it took a terrible toll. And these were often taking out, this violence was inflicted on people who had made a huge contribution to the development of America. So sadly, there is a long history to this racism, but unfortunately, under the encouragement of President Donald Trump and his staff, racist, xenophobic attitudes surged. And so between March 2020 and February 2021, one organization tracked some 3,700 incidents of anti-Asian violence. I think it's shameful. It's a shameful chapter of our history, a shameful part of our present. And why the role of the Chinese in building America was forgotten, part of it also is that relatively little was known about them, that there had been no systematic effort to find out who these people were, how they lived, how they came here, what they did after the railroad was completed. So I co-founded and co-directed the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project with my colleague Gordon H. Chang. And you can go to the website, just search Chinese Railroad Workers in Stanford University. And we collaborated with colleagues in China and all over the world to recover this history. And so now we wanted to make sure that 150 years after the railroad's completion in 2019, the Chinese role would not...
I need to jump in very quickly, if you don't mind, because there's so much to unpack. But in this, in all your research under this project, I want to know, did you find this part of history was actually deliberately erased?
I'm not sure that it was deliberately erased, but it was considered not important. So, for example, you would find a rather irresponsible attitude towards the remains of sites that were associated with the Chinese. And if there were pieces of paper in Chinese that ended up in historical societies, they might not have been given the same attention and preservation as pieces of paper that were written in English. So I think that there was a sense that America claimed credit for the railroad, and particularly white Americans were given credit for it. When Secretary Volpe, Secretary of Transportation, gave a speech at the 100th anniversary of the railroad, he said, "Who but Americans could have done this feat? Who but Americans could have blasted?" And he meant white Americans because, of course, the Chinese were not allowed to become Americans at the time. So there really was a sense that, American history was made by white Americans. It's the old nativists saw this is a white country. It's founded by, white Anglo-Saxons, and they created everything to be proud of. Well, it's just not true.
Right.
People who were black, who were Chinese, who were many different groups, played a huge role in the development of the country. They deserve to get credit for that.
And Shelley, very quickly, you touched on this. I mean, anti-Chinese rhetoric was so prevalent then, and as you also brought up, as we've seen with the previous administration, has a lot of power in today's world. Why is this sentiment so popular still?
Well, I think that it was really encouraged by the past administration, and that's really despicable. President Biden has issued an executive order condemning all of these incidents, and he's taking efforts to try to stem this violence. But there was a green light given to everyone who wanted to blame an Asian person for whatever was wrong with their lives under the last administration, and that was just dreadful. I think there's no excuse for that kind of scapegoating, and there's no excuse for that kind of violence, and I'm ashamed of it as an American.